This is the story of the strangest page in the history of medieval medicine, a drawing of a man who has been stabbed, slashed, clubbed, shot with arrows, bitten by animals, and covered in sores, and who stands there calmly, eyes open, completely alive. Surgeons called him the Wound Man, and for more than 300 years, this walking catalog of human suffering was one of the most trusted images in European surgery. Picture what a surgeon saw when he opened one of these books. A naked male figure stares out of the page at you, a sword has been driven through his neck, a dagger pierces his side, and through his strangely transparent chest you can see the blade's tip touching his heart. Knives and spears stick out of his arms and shoulders like the quills of a porcupine. Arrows are buried in his thighs, some intact, some snapped down to just the head lodged in the flesh. A club is smashing into his skull, his skin is dotted with cuts, lesions, and swellings, and near his feet, in some versions, a dog and a snake are sinking their teeth into him. Every single injury a human being could suffer gathered onto one impossible body. And here's the thing that makes it truly bizarre. He doesn't look like he's in pain, he isn't screaming or collapsing. He stands upright, sometimes with an expression that's almost bored, as if being simultaneously stabbed by 14 weapons is just another Tuesday. That calm is not an accident, and it's not bad art. It's the entire point of the image, because the Wound Man was never meant to show you death. He was meant to show you survival. To understand why anyone would draw this, you have to understand the world that needed it. Medieval medicine ran on the theory of the four humors, the idea that health was a balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, a framework stretching back to Hippocrates and Galen. Physicians, the university-trained elite, spent their time examining urine, reading the stars, and prescribing diets and bloodletting to bring those fluids back into harmony. That was medicine for illness. But medieval Europe was also a world of swords, axes, arrows, workshop accidents, animal attacks, and endless war. When a man arrived with an arrowhead buried in his thigh or his scalp split open by a club, humoral theory wasn't going to pull that arrow out. That job belonged to a different kind of healer entirely, the surgeon. Medieval surgery was a hands-on craft learned through apprenticeship rather than university lectures, and often practiced by barber surgeons, the same men who cut hair and pulled teeth. Surgeons were generally ranked below physicians on the social ladder, but they were the ones elbow-deep in the reality of trauma. They stitched wounds, set bones, cauterized bleeding vessels, opened veins for bloodletting, and extracted weapons from living bodies. And they needed knowledge they could reach in a hurry. This is where the Wound Man comes in, because the diagram is not really a picture at all. It's a piece of technology, it's an interface. The Wound Man first appears in surgical manuscripts from Central Europe, and the earliest versions we know of come out of late medieval Bohemia and the German-speaking lands around the start of the 15th century. Manuscripts associated with Ortolf von Beierland, the Würzburg surgeon whose wound medicine texts circulated widely through the region. He typically traveled alongside a surgical treatise known as the Wundarznei, which means wound medicine, a practical handbook of trauma treatments. And the figure worked like a visual table of contents. Each wound on his body was labeled, often with a short caption or a number, and that label pointed the reader to a specific passage in the text nearby. Sword cut to the head, turn to this remedy. Arrow in the thigh, that chapter. Dog bite, over there. Think about what that means for a moment. Long before search engines, before indexes were standard, before most people could even read fluently, someone invented a way to look up information by starting with a picture instead of a word. A surgeon facing a bleeding patient didn't have to page through the entire book hunting for the right treatment. He could glance at the Wound Man, find the injury that matched the one in front of him, and follow the line straight to the answer. Historians of medicine have pointed out that this was a genuinely new way of reading diagrammatically, and it puts this gruesome medieval figure at the very root of something we now take for granted, the infographic. The wound man also didn't work alone. He belonged to a whole family of diagram people that populated medieval medical books. There was the Zodiac Man, whose body was mapped with the 12 astrological signs to tell physicians when the heavens made it safe to operate or bleed a patient. There were bloodletting figures, marked with the precise points where a vein should be opened for each ailment. There was a disease man covered in illnesses and a disease woman whose body was drawn open to reveal her internal organs. Medieval medicine, so often dismissed as primitive, was actually obsessed with organizing knowledge visually, and the wound man was the most dramatic member of that visual family. For most of the 1400s, though, he remained a rare sight, hand-drawn and hand-painted in expensive manuscripts that only a lucky few would ever hold. The only surviving English wound man manuscript, for instance, is today held at the Wellcome Collection in London, a testament to just how fragile this knowledge chain really was. What changed everything was the printing press. In July of 1491, in the workshop of the Gregori brothers in Venice, the Wound Man appeared in print for the first time, inside a book called the Fasciculus Medicinae, often described as one of the first printed medical anthologies in Europe. Print took an image that had lived in scattered manuscripts and multiplied it across the continent. Copies and adaptations spread on both sides of the Alps in multiple languages, and hand-drawn versions began copying the printed ones. The Wound Man had gone, in modern terms, viral. And as he spread, he evolved, because the ways humans hurt each other were evolving too. In 1517, a German military surgeon named Hans von Gersdorff published the Fieldbook der Wundarznei, the Fieldbook of Surgery, in Strasbourg. Gersdorff was no armchair scholar. He had spent decades as an army surgeon and is reputed to have performed around 200 amputations in an age with no anesthesia as we know it and no concept of germs. His book covered gunshot wounds, amputation techniques, and battlefield medicine, and its woodcut illustrations, carved by the artist Hans Wachtlin, became famous across Europe. Gersdorff's Wound Man carried something no previous version had: cannonballs. One strikes the figure's wrist, another his shin, because gunpowder had arrived on the battlefield and the old catalog of swords and arrows was no longer complete. The diagram had been updated the same way we would update software today. New threat detected, new entry added. That single detail tells you the Wound Man was a living document, a working tool that surgeons genuinely relied on, not just a decorative horror. He kept working for a very long time. The image was reused, redrawn, and reprinted well into the 1600s. As late as 1678, the London surgeon John Browne included a wound man in his complete Discourse of Wounds, Browne being one of the last major English surgeons to treat the image as a serious clinical reference rather than a historical curiosity. By then, the figure had been transformed into an elegant, almost heroic neoclassical nude, leaping across the page like a sculpture come to life, still bristling with weapons. Versions of the wounded figure even traveled far beyond Europe, appearing in Japanese surgical manuscripts in the 18th century. 300 years of service across continents for a single medieval diagram. Very few images in the history of science can claim that kind of career. So what finally killed the Wound Man? In a word, anatomy. From the mid-1500s onward, medicine's center of gravity shifted toward dissection, toward Andreas Vesalius and his 1543 De Humani Corporis Fabrica, arguably the greatest anatomy book ever written, with its extraordinarily detailed dissection plates that showed precisely what lies beneath the skin in a way no symbolic diagram ever could. Surgical books filled up with these detailed anatomical plates, and the old symbolic catalog of injuries began to look like what it was, a relic of a different way of thinking. The Wound Man didn't show you how the body worked. He showed you what the world could do to it, and what a surgeon could do in response. Once medicine started asking different questions, he quietly retired from the textbooks. But he never really disappeared. In January of 1997, the Royal College of Emergency Medicine in the United Kingdom adopted a coat of arms, and standing on one side of the shield is a wound man, chosen deliberately to represent the trauma patient, the person hit by every kind of injury at once, exactly the patient emergency doctors trained to save. 5 centuries later, the profession that deals with stabbings, crashes, and catastrophic injury looked back through history and picked this battered medieval figure as its symbol. There's something quietly moving about that. Fiction found him too, though it took him somewhere much darker. In Thomas Harris's 1981 novel Red Dragon, the story that introduced the world to Hannibal Lecter, a victim is discovered arranged with multiple injuries echoing a wound man illustration from an old medical text, and the image later appeared on screen in the television series Hannibal. A drawing created to help surgeons heal became, in the hands of a fictional serial killer, an instrument of horror. And in a strange little footnote of literary history, Ian Fleming reportedly considered The Wound Man as a title for the James Bond novel that became Dr. Number art historian Jack Hartnell, who wrote the definitive book on the subject. Wound Man, The Many Lives of a Surgical Image, has argued that the figure's persistence across cultures and centuries speaks to something fundamental about how human beings have always needed to organize the experience of bodily trauma. And it's hard to disagree, looking at the full sweep of the image's history. Which brings us back to the question we started with. Why does this image refuse to die? Part of it is simple, morbid fascination. The Wound Man is shocking, and he was probably meant to be. A figure bristling with weapons grabs the eye of any reader flipping past in 1491 or today. But look at him longer and the horror starts to invert, because the text surrounding him was never a list of ways to die. It was a list of ways to be saved. Beside the sword cut, a treatment. Beside the arrow, a method of extraction. Beside the bite, a salve. Every wound on his body existed on that page because some surgeon, somewhere, believed it could be survived. That's the real decoding of the Wound Man. He isn't a monument to violence. He's a monument to stubborn, practical hope, drawn by people who had no antibiotics, no anesthesia, no germ theory, and who still refused to accept that a wound had to be a death sentence. He stands calmly because he represents every patient who walked back out of the surgeon's room alive. Medieval medicine gets remembered for its failures, for the bloodletting and the astrology and the theories that turned out to be wrong. The Wound Man is the other side of that story. He's evidence that even in a world of humors and horoscopes, there were craftsmen quietly building something that looks a lot like modern trauma medicine, one labeled injury at a time. The most bizarre medical diagram in history turns out to be one of the most human documents the Middle Ages ever produced. He took a sword to the neck, a dagger to the heart, arrows, clubs, cannonballs, and 500 years of history. And he's still standing,